Hey guys, what's going on? Dr. Frank here, the founder of Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching Programs. And in today's brief video, I want to take some time and talk about cannabis or THC and mental health. Here at Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching, we help people quit nicotine, THC, energy drinks, and adult media content. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed today's video and check out the links in the description below for additional help at the end of the video. So there's really two scenarios when it comes to THC and mental health. Now, although this is a channel dedicated to helping those who struggle with addiction to THC, there is a reality. THC absolutely does have medicinal benefit. It can benefit people with PTSD. It can benefit people with anxiety. It can benefit people with depression. It can benefit people with chronic pain whose mental health is now suffering because they've been in chronic pain. So THC has a world of benefits, but that's not what this channel is about. I want to talk about two scenarios when it comes to cannabis and mental health and addiction. Scenario number one is the individual, and this was in part myself, kind of, who is using cannabis to cope with pre-existing mental health conditions and that they never really sought care for them. So this might be the person who has a long history of trauma. Maybe you've been through a divorce, maybe you were abused growing up, maybe it was some other type of physical or psychological trauma that you've experienced. And maybe that trauma has resulted in depression and anxiety. Now, in many people's cases, they'll self-medicate. They'll self-medicate with alcohol, they'll self-medicate with nicotine, and they'll self-medicate with cannabis. And if you had pre-existing conditions, anxiety, depression, trauma, PTSD, and you never really put in the work to try and cope with those or to try and manage those, I think now is a really good point in your journey to do that. A lot of people, when they're quitting cannabis products, they can't seem to quit. They struggle to quit the addiction. And the reality is, if we have that pre-existing stuff and the person never integrated healthy mechanisms of coping or therapies such as maybe cognitive behavioral therapy or EDMR therapy to help them, that addiction, the chances of beating it, I think are much slimmer. We can't fully ignore our past when it comes to cannabis addiction. And I would challenge you, if that's you, today would be a good day to go seek help. Today would be a good day to go and connect with a social worker, a licensed therapist, someone that you can talk to. I'm not looking for you to get prescribed a bunch of drugs, although maybe that winds up being a solution for you that works. But what I really want you to do is learn techniques that are non-prescription based. I want you to partake in talk therapy, and I want you to try and work through these things. So then when you approach your quitting journey of cannabis, it becomes much easier. Now, I do want to say a quick disclaimer. A lot of people who suffer from trauma, when I ask them why they're addicted to weed or why they can't break this addiction, that never even comes up in the conversation. So just on an aside, don't blame your addiction on a history of trauma or anxiety or depression if it doesn't apply to you. I would never want you to use those things to justify an addiction or something that's now a negative in your life. Now, scenario number two comes down to the individual who maybe didn't have much anxiety pre-existing. Maybe they didn't have depression. Maybe they didn't have ADHD symptoms pre-existing to their substance use. So I know for me, prior to using marijuana products, yeah, I had anxiety. I always had a bit of depression, but it wasn't an overwhelming feeling. It wasn't an overwhelming thought. Once I got into using more of the high concentration in THC cartridges, my depression got like really, really, really bad. The anxiety turned into full-blown panic attacks. It got really, really bad. And the problem was I was in this facade of addiction. I thought that the cannabis was making those things better. I thought that it was helping me with the anxiety, helping me with the depression. And the situation was actually quite different. I had a substance abuse addiction The anxiety was in part because I was spending my money on cannabis. So I was in a bad financial situation, which leads to depression and leads to anxiety. My relationships were suffering because of my cannabis use. And that in turn leads to depression and anxiety. The addiction was isolating me. Instead of being out doing things I enjoy, working on my goals, working on my future, I was isolated. That's what addiction does. It isolates a person. And that isolation was making the anxiety and the depression and the panic attacks 1,000 times worse. Now, on top of that, as I've talked about in other videos, which I'll link in the description below, I also started to begin to suffer from the early stages of psychosis or depersonalization, especially as I got into using the heavier concentration THC products and things like that. So my mental health was rapidly declining because of the addiction. I'm not even saying necessarily because of the cannabis, but cannabis was one of my drugs of choice, and the consequences of addiction was eroding away at my mental health. And what it really came down to was looking at my situation and saying, okay, look, you're smoking because you have anxiety and depression, but you still have anxiety and depression. If anything, it's getting worse. So I had to take a step back and realize what I was currently doing was no longer working. I had to make a change. So if you're stuck in that situation where you're under the impression that cannabis is helping out with the anxiety and the depression, maybe ask yourself, are you still depressed? Are you still anxious? Are there other underlying things that you never worked through from your past? Or were these things not there before? And did they develop because of this addiction and because of the consequences of having a substance use disorder? And now are you just using that drug to cope with the consequences of a lifestyle brought to you by active addiction? That's really what I want you guys to ask yourselves. Let me know in the comments below, which category do you fall into? Category number 1, where there was a bunch of pre-existing stuff that maybe it's time you work through because you need to do that in order to have success in your long-term recovery? Or are you in scenario number 2, where quitting might actually be the solution to the anxiety and the depression and the PTSD and the stuff that's developed because of a substance use disorder? Let me know where you're at. Now, if you've worked with people before and you haven't had success, here at Addiction Mindset Recovery Coaching, I have some exciting stuff for you guys on top of my new audio equipment. I'm going to be offering group coaching classes. Now, I want to be clear, we don't diagnose or treat OCD disorder. We don't diagnose or treat PTSD or bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety. We help people develop a plan to achieve long-term sobriety and long-term recovery. Part of that plan might be getting you in touch with other licensed therapists on our team to help you work through those other conditions, okay? So just want to be clear about what it is we actually do here. Now, coming up, we're going to be launching group coaching, which is super exciting. As always, we're still offering, of course, the one-on-one coaching sessions where you work with me directly. And then we have our free course on quitting THC, nicotine, and pornography linked in the description below. That's 100% free. And follow me into the next video where I talk a little bit about THC-induced psychosis, especially if this is something that you're concerned about. I'll see you there.